That One Future CPA podcast is produced by Beyond the Balance Media.
The U.S. economy is growing, and not just by a little. In the third quarter of 2025, GDP expanded at a 4.3% annualized pace, the strongest reading in roughly 2 years and well above expectations. And yet, almost everyone you talk to feels the opposite: constrained, stretched, or flatlined. That gap between what the numbers say and what people feel is not just confusion, it's a measurement problem. This is That One Future CPA podcast. My name is Christopher Dickerson. Today we are talking about GDP, how it's calculated, what it measures, and why it doesn't tell you whether life actually feels better right now. We are going to layer in actual GDP numbers from quarter two and quarter three of 2025, inflation data from CPI and PCE, which is the Fed's preferred inflation gauge, and why the lived experience of inflation and cost pressures can diverge from these headline metrics. This isn't macro theory, it's more about what these numbers do and what they do not capture. Here's what the data has been telling us about these GDP numbers. In the third quarter of 2025, real GDP, which is the gross domestic product, right? So real GDP grew by 4.3% annualized, driven by spending on services and exports, and a small drag from imports. In Q2 of 2025, GDP was revised to about 3.8% annualized growth, which is again stronger than earlier estimates. These are robust headline growth rates. Like, there's no way getting around it. These are incredibly strong numbers, especially after a weak Q1 earlier in the year. But growth in output is not the same as growth in everyday financial breathing room. And here's why. Understanding inflation is key to how we interpret GDP. Two big measures matter, and so we're going to break it down here. First is the CPI, which is the Consumer Price Index. And you actually hear the CPI quoted a lot of times on the news, hearing any type of soundbite about, where grocery prices are or where inflation is at. You're most likely hearing a CPI number. And what that looks like is recent data shows US CPI inflation at about 2.7% year over year, with core CPI, excluding food and energy, roughly at 2.6%. A couple of things to know for background. The Federal Reserve, right, which is in the news now, but I'm not going to get into that because it's not a political podcast, but the Federal Reserve has two mandates, which is inflation and employment. And so it's supposed to use all the levers at its disposal, including interest rates and quantitative easing and these types of things that impact the money supply. And the goal is to get an inflation target of 2%. Remember, it is not possible for prices not to grow, right? So that's not the conversation that the Fed or the government ever has. They know prices are going to grow year over year, and the Fed's job is to help maintain that price around 2%. So when we say that recent data shows at 2.7%, you could say that inflation still remains sticky. This is why people are still feeling that pressure. And even when you take out things like food and energy, the reason why you take those out is because they can be volatile. They can also be seasonal. You're still at 2.6%. So that's still quite a bit above the target. And yes, lower than where it was at the highs of the previous administration, but again, nowhere near target and nowhere near a place where consumers are feeling better about those prices. The next metric we're going to talk about is the PCE, Personal Consumption Expenditures Price Index. Personal Consumption Expenditures Price Index, or PCE. This is what the Federal Reserve is actually targeting. So for Q3 2025, PCE inflation was around 2.8%, with core PCE at almost 3%. So you can see why there's still questions about, when you're digging down into some of these headline numbers, like, yeah, it's great. It's just like when people praise the stock market. It's like, yeah, that's great, but a lot of people are not in the stock market. We talk about GDP. It's like, yeah, that's great, but that doesn't really talk about how consumers are actually feeling, right? So we're going to notice a couple of things. There are three things we wanted to point out here. One, both CPI and PCE are above the Fed's 2% goal, meaning inflation is certainly not dead. It's certainly not a hoax. PCE and core PCE are slightly higher than CPI in this period, and these inflation numbers are not high, disastrously high. They're not, red alarm high, but they are sticky and they are persistent. Um, Persistent inflation matters because GDP growth numbers are real, which means they're adjusted for inflation, but nominal output still reflects price movement. What this means is that if costs rise faster than real income, growth looks okay on paper, but real purchasing power doesn't improve. What is purchasing power? That's just the ability that you have to spend your money and how much you get back for that. So you can think of it as $5, right? I remember when I was a kid or a teenager when I started learning how to drive and stuff like that, we would always say like, yeah, I mean, I could take you there, just give me $5 for gas. That used to be sort of like, a pretty good amount of money that you could put into your gas tank and, whatever. And then, most likely used it at Sonic or at McDonald's. But so now it's like the purchasing power of that same $5. Would you ask your friend to give you $5 for gas? No, you most likely would ask maybe like $7 or $8. Maybe you wouldn't ask at all. Maybe you're super generous. But growing up, I was not. So for me, I'd be like, yeah, give me $5 for gas. Now I might ask for a little bit more, and that's where you see the actual impact of the decrease of your purchasing power. So let's dig into both of these metrics. Remember CPI, the Consumer Price Index, and PCE, which is the Personal Consumption Expenditure Price Index. And we're going to notice a couple of problems. One, CPI is a fixed basket measurement that may not reflect substitution behavior when prices shift. So basically what's happening with the CPI is they're taking a basket of goods, the same basket of goods, and they're pricing it every single month. And they're saying how much is the price of this basket of goods over last year and over last month. And so that isn't how consumers shop. I mean, think of it this way. If one thing is name brand potato chips is something of a conversation in my family, right? So like we don't really buy name brand potato chips anymore. We have substituted that for store brands for two reasons. One, some of them are saltier and we're kind of salty people. We like salt. So just I shouldn't be sharing that publicly. But yeah, we're salty people. So sometimes the store brand potato chips are a bit saltier. I'm just being be honest with you. But two, they're cheaper. So generally speaking, like month over month, if something you were buying, or even year over year, something you were buying was more expensive, you would most likely change your buying behavior. You wouldn't continue to buy the same thing over and over. So CPI being measured against a fixed basket doesn't really actually reflect the way consumers are purchasing items. You will shift down, substitute, right? Something that you're buying. If you find it cheaper, you're not going to say like, yeah, these Hormel sausages are what I always buy. I'm going to buy them every single month. You might just switch down to the store brand. PCE has broader coverage and is the Fed's preference, but it still averages across households. And we know anytime, here's what I'll say. When data or numbers are involved and you see averages, you should most likely be skeptical of that data, because remember that average as a calculation is highly sensitive to outliers. So if there are, let's say, like, for example, that's why you hear the term median income and not average income, because there are incredibly poor people and there are incredibly wealthy people, and those outliers impact the average, while the median is a better measurement of that middle number rather than an average of all the numbers. A little math lesson for you. Okay, so that averaging across households again doesn't give us an accurate picture of what's really happening. Neither of these metrics is really telling us how inflation affects different people, right? Especially when housing, healthcare, or insurance costs are growing faster than the official average. I mean, we could talk about healthcare insurance. I'm blessed to be a grad student, and so I get to get my insurance from school. I have a job offer for a really great company, and I'm going to be able to get private insurance through them. But there are a lot of people, especially people. I think people misunderstand. I think people don't think about this. You know, people who are on sometimes these programs like the Affordable Care Act to get health insurance, they're not ne'er-do-wells. They're not in the basement playing video games. Some of them are business owners, and business owners have to have insurance. They have to pay for that. They have to get that coverage. And so some of them as well, they're facing doubling or tripling of premiums. And I will say that a lot of the plans that are being floated out there by the current administration just simply don't provide enough financial coverage to help people face the realities of these increasing costs. When we talk about housing, housing is something that is across the board expensive, but also very regional and geographically, sorry, what am I trying to say? Geographically constrained or targeted? I don't know. What I'm basically trying to say is like housing is really bad across the country, but it's like terrible in places that are booming in the Sun Belt, right? That are not able to get enough housing supply online. And lastly, insurance in places like Florida. Florida is getting hit with an interesting sort of crisis, multiple crises at the same time. Housing crisis where a lot of these older buildings are having these new requirements for maintenance because of what happened with the condo building collapse a couple of years ago. So they're having to pay for those things. So when people are trying to sell their condos, people are like, "Well, I have this huge. I don't even know that term. I think the term is abatement, but I'm trying to remember. I think it is abatement. I don't think so. I'm not sure. But this coming bill I'm gonna have to do for maintenance on the condo. I mean, that's gonna affect the selling price, and on top of that, you have insurance rates that are going through the roof. So you're having these two pressures on the housing market that it's kind of a disaster in some places in Florida to try and sell your condos. So I mean, when the headline number of CPI is 2.7% and PCE is 2.8% approximately for both, of course, you can get a number that looks closer to target while many households are feeling a sharper squeeze, right? This is also the conversation about tariffs because tariffs impact lower income households more because they're the ones who are buying some of these lower price consumer products and they're the ones who are having to then pay some of those additional costs with tariffs. And so when we think about like, oh, the prices haven't been passed down to consumers or it hasn't impacted consumers as badly, well, that might be a misnomer because it could be impacting lower income households greater than it is higher income ones. I mean, it's really just it's a distribution issue. It's not a reporting error, but it's more about us trying to better understand how the numbers are coming in and what they really mean. And like I said, when we're seeing these averages and we're seeing some of the ways in which the data is being compiled, it sort of gives us reasons to pause and just be a bit more analytical in our analysis of some of these headline metrics. All right, next let's really talk about like what GDP is, how it's calculated, because I mean this is a number that it drives markets, it drives legislation, excuse me, it drives markets, it drives legislation. Politicians are influenced by this, business leaders are influenced by this, banks are influenced by this. So it is important for us to know what GDP even is. So GDP includes prices and output, right? So here's how inflation seeps into this growth story. But remember, we're talking about 4.3% in Q3, which is pretty large, right? So we're trying to understand like how does that seep into this activity here. So if prices rise across many categories, nominal output rises even if quantity doesn't. What does that mean? So if I have 10, I don't know, 10 loaves of bread and it costs $10, and then those same 10 loaves of bread cost $11, it looks like nominal output is rising, but the quantity isn't, right? I'm still just selling 10 loaves of bread. GDP is real, but the adjustments don't capture how inflation redistributes spending power across households. When you hear the term real, all I'm going to say, because I don't want to really get into how the adjustment happens, just know that it is adjusted. It's not nominal, it's adjusted, but it doesn't capture how that inflation is impacting different levels of household. It's almost averaging the impact across. And I can tell you straight up, like I'm a graduate student. I could, the way that inflation is impacting me is not the same as it's impacting, someone in my position who's been out in the workforce for 5 years, or my grandparents who are on a fixed income, right? Or, my brother who has two kids to raise, right? All of us are feeling the impacts of inflation in very different ways, but a lot of these metrics are not capturing how that's impacting different households. It's more like averaging across everyone. And again, averages should make us a bit skeptical. It doesn't mean it's wrong. Averages make us a bit skeptical about the data. Here's some examples, right? So if housing and healthcare prices grow faster than wages, people have less discretionary cash, even if GDP rises. So it's like, yeah, like the, I, I, I'm not making as much money. Everything is costing more, right? So it's like I have less discretionary cash, but GDP still looks good because output is still happening. And because inflation is baked into consumer behavior differently than GDP deflator adjustments are, you can have growth and compression at the same time. This is exactly why it's important to understand a formula, right? That's why it's important to understand what a financial term means and what the formula is. And I'm not going to get into the formula, but it's actually very easy to calculate GDP. It's not a difficult formula to do at all. But an understanding of that formula helps you understand some of these top line numbers and what's really going into them. So this is why when we look at this data, GDP and inflationary trends can sometimes feel in conflict with each other. And so this brings us into sort of like income and cost and like what's really happening out there, because real wages, when adjusted for inflation and pressures, have been sluggish. That's just the truth. As CPI stays near 2.5% and PCE at 2.8% approximately, inflation erodes our purchasing power if wage gains don't keep pace. We if wages were, growing at 2.5% annualized rate for a year, then we would not be feeling some of the pressures from these inflationary cost rises. Geez, I'm slurring my words here. We would not be feeling some of these cost pressures because of inflation, because our wages would be keeping pace, but that's not what's happening, right? Um, even if official inflation rates are not sky high, the components that matter most to everyday budgets, like housing, insurance, and healthcare, can grow faster than the aggregate indices suggest. So what this tells us is that three things, right? One, GDP can rise, inflation can be moderate, but households can still feel poor. And that's exactly what's happening. I mean, you tell, a family of, a husband and wife and three kids that GDP is at 4.3%, they're going to say, what does that even mean for me, right? Prices are still high. In fact, prices are still above the target. And this is because GDP is about output, not net disposable income after essential costs. It's just about output. So as prices rise and there's more output out there, right? It's just that it's the same example of the bread, right? 10 loaves of bread for $10, 10 loaves of bread for $11, right? That additional dollar is going into that GDP calculation, but the output stays the same. That's why it is important. And this is not a complicated, it seems complicated because the government is doing it and there's charts. You can literally go and just like, how is GDP calculated? And it's like a very, very, very simple calculation. Knowledge is power. Knowledge is the ultimate power, because that helps you understand like, hey, what's really going on in the market? How can it be that the government is celebrating, 4.3% GDP, and I'm still struggling? Looking at that formula can help you better understand what's going on and what a financial term means and what the formula is. And I'm not going to get into the formula, but it's actually very easy to calculate GDP. It's not a difficult formula to do at all. But an understanding of that formula helps you understand some of these top line numbers and what's really going into them. So this is why when we look at this data, GDP and inflationary trends can sometimes feel in conflict with each other. And so this brings us into sort of like income and cost and like what's really happening out there, because real wages, when adjusted for inflation and pressures, have been sluggish. That's just the truth. As CPI stays near 2.5% and PCE at 2.8% approximately, inflation erodes our purchasing power if wage gains don't keep pace. We if wages were, growing at 2.5% annualized rate for a year, then we would not be feeling some of the pressures from these inflationary costs. All right, let's recap. I really like doing this episode because I'm a little bit of a formula nerd and I love looking at these bits of information as we get them, and what they mean. And so let's sort of like just recap what we know is happening right now, right? So GDP has been growing, as we mentioned, 4.3% in Q3, 3.8% in Q2, approximately in 2025. However, inflationary measures are still rather high, above our 2% Fed target, with CPI at approximately 2.7% and PCE at 2.8%, which is showing persistent price growth. But these numbers don't tell you who is benefiting and how these costs compares to incomes. As we mentioned, I'm a single grad student. My brother has two kids. My grandparents have a fixed income. My friend's been a CPA for a couple of years. All of us are experiencing these cost pressures. All of us are experiencing inflation in much different ways. And unfortunately, the CPI, the CPI and the PCE are unable to capture all of these unique experiences with inflation, which is why these numbers feel maybe a bit disconnected from reality. So that's why the economy can be bigger on paper while people feel tighter in practice, and that's just the truth. This is not so much a mismeasurement, right? It's not so much a misstatement. It's not even a lie. What it is, it's a mismatch between what the numbers are measuring and what you're living on a daily basis. And so it could make you feel crazy thinking like, stock market is blowing up. Google just became one of the $4 trillion companies. GDP is off the charts. All these things are happening, la la la. But why am I not feeling better? And most people are not feeling better because, again, inflation is still sticky. And even though we know that prices will grow year over year, month over month, we still want to be below that 2% target for the Fed. And I don't foresee that happening until the middle of 2027, especially with some of the pressures we are still seeing from tariffs, pressures on beef prices, and certainly pressures on electricity and utility prices, healthcare. I mean, everything. So basically, everything is an indicator that we will see more of this. So pay attention to the data, dig into it, all the information, all the charts, all the background data is available to you. Ask the right question, Google it, drop a comment if you have questions about how these things are being calculated or how they're impacting your everyday life. But I really enjoyed doing this episode, the first episode of our season 3 of that One Future CPA podcast. It's my last semester of grad school. I'm taking all 4 sections of the CPA exam, so I don't even know what the season's going to look like. But I'm hoping in our next episode that we can sort of dig into the jobs numbers, which is really sort of asking the question, why payroll growth can look strong even as work feels more precarious, and how the same measurement issues are showing up, right? So this is really a conversation about how these numbers are breaking down and how they really impact our everyday lives. I might drop a bonus episode just talking about, where we're at as, we end the journey of that One Future CPA podcast to become that CPA podcast. Um, so yeah, just take, follow, you could watch on YouTube, you can listen on Spotify, Amazon Music, Apple Music, wherever you get your podcasts, as people say. So yeah, thank you. I really appreciate it. This is again that One Future CPA podcast. My name is Christopher Tickerson, and we will see you next time.